Good morning, everybody. I am so pleased that we're all here. Welcome to the second meeting of Craic, Creativity, Resolution, Art, Illness, and Community. If anybody's having any audio difficulties, any difficulties at all, on your panel box down in the lower right, you should see a question box where you can type in a question to Vicki and my right-hand woman here, and she should be able to give you a hand, and we'll see if we can get you participating. I also want to share with you that in this particular meeting, which lasts about an hour, give or take, we'll have about 10, maybe 15 minutes at the end for discussion, and as we, mostly me, get more comfortable with the whole webinar process, we're going to make it much more interactive. So I hope you enjoy today, and I'm looking forward to your questions. With that said, I'd like to introduce you to our two musicians, artists in residence. First of all, Mr. Scott Patito. Say hello, Scott.
Hello.
Scott, as we can see here from the bio, is a pleasure for me to work with. He is a Grammy-nominated composer. He's done all kinds of interesting stuff. He's really I think of a real man of all seasons, producer, bassist, multi-instrumentalist, and he has this really interesting recording studio in Catskill, and that's how I met him, and I've been learning a lot from him in the process of recording and working as a musician, so that's been really wonderful for me. He works with Beth, and say hi, Beth.
Hey there, everybody.
Hi. Beth and Scott work together. She's kind of his right-hand woman right now. She's done a whole variety of things, recorded and performed with a list of folks here, and they have worked together since '97. She's also worked as a publicist, radio promoter, and a whole variety of things. So they both bring a really interesting perspective to the process of being creative and improvisation, not only on the bandstand but in the studio, and they've been enormously helpful to me. Now, with that said, I'm going to take about 10 minutes or so. Let me introduce Vicki. Vicki, say hello.
Hello, everybody.
Vicki is my partner in crime in terms of the organization and the whole process of working with the webinar, and works with me at AHMA. And all four of us are here today with you all. Now, so let's talk about innovation, creation, improvisation. Or improvisation, creation, and innovation, probably in that order, working the third phase. For those of you who are familiar with some of my clinical work, I had developed these 4 phases of chronic experience: crisis, and the third, crisis being the first, second and the third being resolution, and the fourth being integration. Today we're really going to focus on the third phase. And part of the point of the third phase is that in the process of being chronically ill or disabled or whatever it is that people are coping with in life, that developing meaning about our suffering really helps liberate us and help us have a whole life, not just a life that has illness or suffering in it. So it's just some food for thought there. And I'm going to throw a lot of different ideas at you. Now, innovation and creation. Improvisation leads to creation and can lead to innovation. And these are important concepts to keep in mind, or ideas to keep in mind when we're thinking about change. Improvisation is a wonderful response to change. Change is inevitable. It can be good, it can be bad, but it is absolutely going to happen. So improvisation, creation, and innovation help us respond to change. Important to keep in mind. I believe that creation is a very powerful stance against helplessness. Whether it's the helplessness that I feel as a chronically ill person, something I've dealt with since I was a little kid, or in the creative process. I function as an artist, I function as a researcher, as a scientist first. Creation in all of these arenas help me continue to take action. Now, in order for me to do this effectively, I have to constantly reflect on what my abilities are, and I'll talk about that more in a second, what active reflection means in the process of creative action. And it must be authentic. Authenticity, real important term here, authenticity. In the process of creation, it's absolutely necessary to maintain insight about your limitations and your abilities. It's essential for me, and I offer you all that idea. This can be very painful for me, but to the extent that I know what I can do in any given day is really, really important to my ability to help others and to function as an artist, to function as a clinician. So to the extent that I can do that, it allows me to really have much more freedom and to really be authentic. And here's one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite founding fathers: the price of freedom is internal vigilance, that I really need to maintain that insight. Now I'm going to share with you some ideas about what I call the 5 capacities. This is not an exhaustive list. These are just some ideas for me. Feel free to take the ones you like, throw out the ones you don't, create your own, but these are the ones that have some meaning for me. I believe that it's important for us to establish acceptance and meaning in our changed circumstances, whether our changed circumstances are changed as an artist or as a physically disabled person, physically challenged person. So what you do, whether you are a clinician, whether you are a chef, whether you're a painter, that's something you need to take into account with the capacities that count for you, your personality, and how circumstances may mean that other capacities for you are required. So in addition to these 5, think about what you need to discover in terms of helps and capacities for you and define them. What are they? Now I'm going to share with you these 5 capacities one at a time. Real important one for me that I learned a long time ago when I was a hospice worker is that I had to learn how to tolerate ambiguity. I learned that it was unavoidable, that ambiguity in life is absolutely unavoidable, and I had to learn how to survive that not knowing. And ambiguity is not knowing what's going to happen, what's going to happen next, what's the prognosis going to be. Will I get the idea I need to get? I don't know. So I have to learn, and I'm always learning, how to be uncomfortable and to tolerate that discomfort. In my thinking, this is learning how to do the emotional heavy lifting, and this leads to wisdom. In this regard, wisdom is appreciating the value of the unknown, the realization that something good can come of this. Another capacity that I have a lot of value for is curiosity. Become curious. Change is an opportunity for curiosity, and curiosity leads to innovation and change. Now, our culture can squelch a child's curiosity, wonder, or risk-taking. So we need to be thinking about, not for ourselves and for others, how does the culture support our capacity for curiosity, or does it not like it? Is it influenced by, is it okay for a boy to be curious and not a girl, or vice versa, or race or social class? In our culture, curiosity has been given positive connotations, like childlike wonder and awe, but also nosy ones, like curiosity killed the cat, or ones that for some people go either way, encouraged to question authority, and some are encouraged not to. The capacity of taking risks. Personally, I take the risk of getting started every day. I don't know on any given day how my body is going to behave, and that's something I have to take into account when I put my feet on the floor. So I have to take into account what my body can and cannot do, and the risk of going forward, and then the risk of my creative process. Now, what I find really helpful in taking risks is conscious versus unconscious risk-taking. And I think of unconscious risk-taking as impulsive risk-taking. I prefer calculated risk-taking. To the extent, as I spoke earlier, that I'm trying to be authentic and being informed by the knowledge of my limits and abilities, that helps me take the calculated risk. That's not impulsive. And to the extent that I know my knowledge, I have the knowledge of my limits and abilities, it can, as I'm taking the risk, it helps minimize my shame, it minimizes my embarrassment about taking the risk, and it minimizes my fear of failure, which of course is always there. I try to have an exit strategy. If things don't go as planned, how are we going to, what's the next step going to be? Is there a plan B or a plan C? It helps in the risk-taking process. 4, improvisation. Now, improvisation requires that you make a choice, that there's a statement, whether that statement is something that I make in the clinical interview with a patient, or whether it's a statement or a choice that I make musically on the bandstand. There's going to be a reaction to that choice, and then there's going to be a reaction or a counter-reaction. That's part of the improvisational process. It can go on between 2 people, it can go on between a whole group of people. It can go on between within ourselves. Do I choose in the moment to pick up the paintbrush? What color will I use? That's the choice I'm making in the moment, and I'm going to react to that internally. One of the things I really want to point out, in my view, about improvisation is people sometimes are waiting for the light bulb. They're waiting for the aha moment. And I don't think you need to. I don't think we need to wait for the aha moment. If you get it, great. If it happens, enjoy it, go with it. Maybe you'll get good material with it, but you never know. You don't need the light bulb. You just need to go forward. And thus, innovation. So, you've been curious, you've taken some risks, you've made some choices, and innovation comes out of that. Now, sometimes innovation, it is the light bulb. It's a big deal. In fact, it can be a small deal. It can be an idea, a paragraph, a picture. It can be larger than that. It could be a whole song, but whether small or large, that's a victory. It's really important that we ask for outside help, that we get training, that we look for instruction or assistance, which is part of how Beth and Scott have been helpful to me. As I was moving to the next step in my creative process as a musician, I sought others who know more than I about the process of recording and musicianship, and thus I'm improving. I like to think I'm improving. So it's important to accommodate your limits and abilities in this process. What can you do physically? What can you do psychologically? What can you do artistically? To take in the whole psyche and soma in the process. So, time to launch the poll. So, Vic, I think you're going to launch our first poll here.
Yeah, I've just launched the first poll, and this is which of the 5 capacities do you feel is your strongest? And invited all the attendees to vote in this poll.
Excellent. So while the attendees are voting, and Vic will keep track of that and keep me posted, I'm just going to share with you a little bit about what I think my strongest capacity is. Now, I have to tell you, it varies sometimes from day to day, and it varies over time. I've gotten pretty good at tolerating ambiguity. I can thank my hospice training for that. But I think probably my strongest capacity is my curiosity. I think it's a double-edged sword. Sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes it may not be, but I think mostly it has served me to encourage my curiosity. Vic, how are folks doing with the poll?
They're doing great. Everyone has voted, and no one says that they tolerate ambiguity very well, so I think that's an area.
Well, that's interesting. So that's something that maybe in a future webinar I can talk about that. We can talk about it as a group. That would be very interesting. What else do they have there?
34% of people say curiosity is their greatest capacity.
Yeah.
11% take risks, and 22% each improvise and innovate.
So one more time. So read that one more time for us.
Well, the leading is becoming curious. That's 44%.
Yeah.
22% each improvise and innovate well, and 11% take risks.
So it sounds like this is more of a curious group, and maybe this ambiguity is something that something we could talk about and work on in the future. Certainly, one of the things about these capacities to keep in mind is that they really do support each other. To the extent that I can tolerate ambiguity, it supports my curiosity. And if I'm tolerating ambiguity and I'm allowing myself to be curious, then I'm really positioned to take a good risk. So that's important to keep in mind too, that these capacities support each other. Now, I think now,
I'm going to close this poll.
yeah.
It should be back to you now.
All right, thank you. So let's see. So let's talk about how these 5 capacities respond to change. We just did a little bit about that. And I'm going to now go to the artists. So hi, Scott. Hi, Beth.
Hello.
Hello again.
So we're going to take about 10 minutes. And I want to start by asking the two of you. Scott, let me start with you. Looking at these capacities, these 5 capacities, thinking about the sample of your music that we're going to hear today. And by the way, folks, both a tune from Beth's work and a tune from Scott's work will be up on the website and was sent to you ahead of time, so you'll have a chance to hear it, the whole tune out of their recording portfolio. But so, Scott, of these 5 capacities, which one jumps out at you today?
Tolerating ambiguity.
Yeah, say a little bit about that.
That's probably my strongest capacity.
Mm-hmm.
Strangely enough.
Well,
Partly because I think partly because I don't know where my creativity comes from. So that's very ambiguous.
yeah.
So I have to be willing to tolerate the fact that it's not always there and cope with what comes out. So
Yeah. It's interesting. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a writer, and there's a word for that for writers. They call it writer's block when it doesn't happen.
Exactly.
I don't think we have musician's block, do we? I don't think.
Well, I feel it, sure.
Okay. Okay,
I mean,
that's interesting.
as a trained musician, I have all these ways of getting myself out of problems, which are
Right.
things I've learned. But the truth is, the one problem I can't get myself out of is being creative for I can't force the creativity.
Right,
So
being creative.
I have to, in a way, be able to tolerate the fact that it may or may not be there, which is completely ambiguous.
That's really interesting. It's like you made 2 really good points there. I want to reiterate for all of us, which is, and this relates to something I said earlier. As we learn about these capacities and our own capacities, and we learn about these 5 plus whatever else comes. This is where it's also useful, as I said earlier, to get training, because the training helps support us when we're trying to cope with the ambiguity. I think you just really stated it well, Scott. That the training, the tricks of the trade, so to speak, can sometimes carry you when you don't really know what that next idea is going to come from.
Exactly.
And that's part of the training.
Or when you have a good idea and you write yourself into a corner or can't find a way out, if you have a little bit of a toolbox of tricks or what have you, you can often then you can go back to you can get back in your head. That's what I'd like to think.
Yeah. All right. Well, hold that thought. Now, Beth, I want to ask you too now. What of these capacities, which one jumps out at you today?
I'd say I'm probably just the opposite of Scott, and that tolerating the ambiguity is probably the hardest thing for me. But having a strong curiosity is kind of the thing that can push me through that if I do have enough interest in something.
Yeah.
I want to take it to the next step and just try to find a way to get through that wall.
That's interesting, which may be part of the reason why you two guys work well together, is that you book it. Well, I've certainly seen it, that you bookend each other in different ways. I think that speaks to the issue of community, that any of us can be stronger in any given day or in general in any of these capacities, and all of us have a different amount or type of tools in our tool chests, if you will, as artists, as people. That's very interesting, I think, to me. Now, any thought further on that? Because I think what I'd like to do now, unless there's a comment you want to make, I'd love to hear a short sample of Scott's work. This is I think this particular tune. What's the name of this tune, Scott?
This is called When the Night Spills?
Not When the Night Spills. And this is work that you've done together with your musical partner, Leslie Ritter. She's I believe is the singer on this, correct?
Yes.
And you're doing all your
I'm playing guitar and bass on this one.
interesting.
Probably.
So if we could hear just like a minute of that, so people could just get a sense of that tune, and then I'm going to ask you a question about it, Scott.
Okay.
Day races, chases the light into night still, and its spell pulls apart our we, and I find you, and the night still burn in the pulse of the sun, when the night still tormenting this fire that we made, when I come to you, and the night still.
So if we could stop it there.
Sure.
So Scott, that particular piece, can you reference the 5 capacities in the context of that tune and your work with Leslie?
Yeah, I think all of those capacities are always at play, for me at least, when I write or play music in general.
Now this is an original tune for you and Leslie, yes?
Yeah.
Am I right about that?
Yeah, and in a way it's a little bit of a different thing for us because it's I don't know, it's hard to hear, but it's more or less in a kind of bossa nova Latin samba sort of mode, and we're not necessarily Latin musicians, but I was just influenced by something at the time, and that's what came out. Which is, talks about the ambiguity. One of the things I did when
And the risk taking, that because
that's almost a given for me as an artist or as a musician, because if you don't take risks, you pretty much you might as well, why do it, in a sense.
Right.
Like,
Right. Which is one of the wonderful things about utilizing the arts as we're well, I think of it kind of this way sometimes. Sometimes I feel like being a chronic, having that experience in my life influences me clearly as a clinician, as an author. It's why I chose to be a clinician. And it influences me as a musician, and then my creative work, whether it's in science or whether it's in music or whatever it's in, that in turn influences me and enhances my life. So I see that flow back and forth, which is.
But very quickly, I mean, I can just the concept of this particular song came out of being in a song school, which sort of inspired me to think about writing a piece of music.
Yeah.
And I sat down with an instrument and I said, I'd seen a couple of people playing in an altered tuning on the guitar. It's a thing you do, use the strings and.
Yeah.
So I just picked one, and one I'd never played in before. I had no idea what even the notes were on the guitar. It didn't matter. And then so there's my ambiguity. I'm
right.
In a totally, foreign place, and my curiosity comes about as a result of being in this place and the sounds that I can make. And that, of course, leads to risk-taking, which, of course, is going to make some bad sounds.
Right.
Or bad choices, okay?
Yeah.
And that also, informs your improvisation at that point, because the bad choices, you need to know the bad choices as well as the good ones so you can be a better improviser.
Right, and just one other thought about this is just, thinking about it clinically, which of course is a big part of where I come from, is that one of the things that I say to my patients and say to myself, my number one patient, is, I like for example, today I may have filled my risk-taking quota for the day doing the webinar. Or in another capacity, I may have tolerated my ambiguity quota for the day. I mean, part of the capacities is knowing what my capacity is to take risks at any given time. That's also real interesting. Scott, I'm going to ask you to hang on for a moment, if I could. And Beth, hello, Beth.
Yes.
Hi. So how about you? How about if you take, we have a few minutes left here, how about if you take, in our section, let's hear your tune. If you could put that up for a second.
Sure.
Kept it on the closet shelf, up high way in the back. Sweaters almost hid the case, old leather worn and black. I'd ask my mom to take it down, gently place it on the floor. Stick up all the latches, lift it, stop, and look some more. Would the clothes burn honey brown, blue velvety lady? There was magic in the case that held my father's violin.
So Beth, let me stop you there. And so this, say a few thoughts about this. This is a tune that you wrote, correct?
Yeah.
And say a titch about what that's about, and pick a capacity that relates to that process.
Well, it's completely about curiosity.
Okay.
I mean, it's basically me when I was little wondering about that interesting case up on the top shelf in my parents' closet.
Right.
And that it was a violin in there.
Yeah.
It belonged to my father, which I had never known him to play.
Huh. I didn't know that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what it is. And it's about me discovering this and wanting to know what's in there and finally getting, them to take it down and letting me look at it. And
That's really, okay.
That really was inspiring to me, as I'd always loved music but did not know that my father had had that connection when he was young.
Well, that's interesting in of itself, because as I think about it, as I've listened to the tune a few times, that this is the tune is your father's violin, and it is the entire it's not the lyric is totally about curiosity in and of itself. Interesting. All right. I think what we're going to do now. Any final thoughts, Beth or Scott, before I take it over to the group?
I guess just for people who are trying to be creative under whatever circumstances they're trying to be creative under, is to try to not get discouraged when all the pieces don't fall into place at once. I think that's an age-old problem for artists in general, but probably more so for people who suffer from some issues in their life.
Right. I'm going to hold that thought, and I'm going to ask you guys to weigh in again in a second if you want to. So participants, think about these 5 capacities and what our panelists, what we've been talking about so far. So what is your creative medium? Do you already have one, or have you chosen one? Are you already trying to work in one or two? It doesn't have to be just one. And which of these capacities are your strengths? And Vicki is going to be launching a poll question for you in a second. Which of these capacities are your weaknesses? What kind of help do you need? Real important. That helps with the issue of discouragement that we were just talking about, that to not try to do this in a vacuum. You can do lots of it in a vacuum, but don't, and it's the risk of asking for help. We don't want to look foolish or incompetent or all that uncomfortable stuff. And so, Vic, the poll open for folks?
It is open. It is open, and nearly half of the folks have voted so far.
All right, we'll give them a chance. And what I will do as that's going on, just to reiterate, which of these capacities do you need the most help with? Is it ambiguity? Is it curiosity? Is it taking risks? Is it improvisation? Is it innovation? And here's something I'd also like you all to keep in mind as you're thinking about those capacities. When we are coping with chronic experience, chronic illness, and as I said earlier, speaking for myself, I am somebody who's had chronic illness since I was a kid, and it's something that I always had to take into account in my process of being a clinician, being an author, being a researcher. I think one of the first places I learned about improvisation was not as a musician, was as a hospice worker. So I often think about all the issues that we talked about today, the concepts that came up, that Scott and Beth, that we all talked about. How do they not only apply to me as an artist, but how do they apply to me as a person? And in that regard, what are my capacities? What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? Important to think about that. Vic, how are they doing with the poll?
I think we're about finished. Nearly everyone has voted. There may be some people who are away from their computers for the moment. So we'll close the poll here, and I'll report to you that half of the people said that they need the most hope with tolerating ambiguity, 25% innovation, and 11% each becoming curious and taking risk, and no one feels that improvisation is their greatest need for help.
All right. Well, what I'd like to do then is have all of us, Beth and Scott, I think we're going to open this up. Well, before I do, Vicki's going to be opening this up, and we'll be taking your questions in a second, and I think we're going to be probably answering some questions about ambiguity and kicking that around. But here's something I want you to all keep in mind. In the words of Rahm Emanuel, but among this has been said many ways in many places, many people, you never want to waste a serious crisis. You don't want it to go to waste. It's an opportunity for us to try something else, something that we didn't think we could do before or wouldn't even thought of doing before, whether that's in our personal lives, as we're coping with our health, as we're coping with our circumstances, or whether we're coping as artists. So another poll question for you. So what is that primary artistic medium you intend to work with? Writing, music, painting, sculpting, visual arts, movement, or you're not sure? And as that information is coming in,
It is.
so Vicki, I'm going to let you, as the information comes in, I'm going to let you keep us posted on what people think their medium of choice is.
Okay. People are answering pretty quickly. Are you interested in the results?
Sure.
Right?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. We have 89% of people who've voted, so I think that's consistent with the last poll. 38% are working in a visual medium.
Mm-hmm.
13% each are doing writing, music, or movement, and 25% are either other or not sure yet.
Okay. So it sounds like we've got two kinds of things to talk about amongst ourselves and to take questions. One is that larger issue of tolerating ambiguity, and the other is how it applies across mediums, how it applies as visual artists. That's interesting just to know that that's the portion of folks that have showed up today. So Beth, Scott, I want to go back to as people are formulating questions, and Vic, please, speak up any time that a question comes up. Participants, it's your turn. If you have any thoughts or questions about the project, about any of the ideas, write it into your question box. And as we're talking about these issues, we'll take a crack at the question. So let's go back to ambiguity. While we're waiting for a question, let's go back to ambiguity. Scott, Beth, Where had we left off with that? That was interesting. Talking about the ambiguity of, you talked about being, I think, Scott, at, was it musicians camp? Was it songwriters camp? Was it songwriters workshop?
Yeah, there's a song camp at Warren Wilson College in Asheville, North Carolina, this particular situation. But yeah, it's, and again, this sort of applies to virtually everything I do as a musician, is the one thing that always comes up is finding dead ends, and for one, doing one of two things: knowing when to pursue them a little further, and knowing when to really set them aside or throw them out. And that's something you don't get right away, and that's why I was saying this discouragement that can happen when you, well, if you're a writer, you go through a dry spell. If you're a painter, you might go through a spell where you just can't find a subject or material that's to your liking. And sometimes it just requires you to just do it anyway and set it aside.
Yes.
I think that's been one of the best things for me. Is I think since I went to college years ago, I would write a piece of music. In fact, when I was in college, I used to write a piece of music a day. It didn't matter if it was 2 bars, if it was a full piece, and I'd put it in a box.
Yeah.
And maybe I'd pull it out, you know, a month later, or 2 months, or a year. I've actually found a box recently that's 20 years old, and it's got some good ideas.
Right. But
at the time, I wouldn't have known how to develop them any further. So that's one way, I think, to help conquer ambiguity, is to not let it conquer you.
Well, this is one of the interesting things about that I think is particularly helpful from the discipline of music, and something that I started first when I was a kid is the role of practice. That part of the discipline of practice of you doing that every day. And when I look at our capacities that we've been talking about, these 5 capacities, the way that we get better at them is to put ourselves in the arena of practice every single day. So whether it's, you know, as you said, 2 bars, whether it's 2 paragraphs, whether it's 2 minutes, that effort, that daily effort, is part of what enhances our tool chest and helps us, that in of itself, doing it every day, helps us tolerate the ambiguity. From the world of writers, Dorothy Parker talked about that every day you had to sit in the chair. You know, the art of writing was writing, that you had to get up and do it, even if you did it badly or well or mediocre, and you never knew that particular day how it was going to turn out. But that the discipline was part of learning about and tolerating and developing the capacities.
Well, another way I can look at tolerating ambiguity is to think of it in terms of style.
Yep.
You know, all artists want to develop a style, and if you have some semblance of an idea over months, years, weeks, whatever it takes you to develop a style, some of which is going to come naturally from you, and some of it's going to come from what you were exposed to and how you process that.
Right.
So right there, and then, you know, I could talk about all the artists who work through many different styles or periods, and a lot of that is because they were practicing the style in order to master it, and then they felt free to move on, which is a way to also deal with being ambiguous in what you do.
Well, you know, I see an interesting correlation between people saying they have the strength in improvisation, and I think that comes from anyone that's had a chronic illness.
Right.
Their life is about improvisation. There always has to be a plan B. And I think their feeling that they don't have a strength in the ambiguity is more about not having a strength in perspective, because really they've had to live with that ambiguity their whole life. So,
right.
You know what I'm saying? So really it's about trying to give themselves a little pat on the back for any of the victories that they have achieved, and try to step a little outside of beating themselves up, and they just may. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Right, and that. But I was talking to Beth earlier this morning, and given sometimes what happens with my chronic illness is it affects my throat, it affects my vocal cords, and we're joking that
Oops.
when I got up this morning, my voice was, it's like, well, I'll have some tea, I'll do this and do that, and Beth joked and said, well, it works for him. So, but
I'm not sure who can hear me. This is Vicki. Pat, if you can hear me, there seems to be problems with your audio.
it's willingness to take that risk, Pasties. I'm sorry?
We've lost you.
At least on my end, the audio is fading out when you're speaking. And I also wanted to mention that we do have 3 questions from the participants.
Vic, whose audio is fading out?
Yours is.
Whose audio is fading out?
Pat, yours is.
Patricia's. Okay. Vic, why don't you offer the questions to Beth and Scott one at a time?
Well, Janice Jones has a question about how to get started with a project.
You want me to take it, Beth?
Sure.
Okay, well, again, a project. Now, this is an interesting notion right there. If you're talking about a creative project, whether that's a painting or a piece of music or whatever, if you're not feeling particularly creative that day, meaning that the Beethoven Fifth Symphony isn't going to pop out of your head, or a Picasso painting, then you need to kind of develop a process. And that process to creating a project might be anything from sitting down and taking very small elements. If you're a painter, maybe you do some sketches. If you're a musician, you would also do sketches, but they'd be musical sketches. You try to develop an idea. And then hopefully your creativity starts to kick in, and a lot of ideas come up. That to me is how I start a project. The project doesn't really take on the word or term project for me until it's actually probably gestated a little bit, and it's really kind of it's showing a direction. And that always doesn't happen on the first day. It's not like it's not like doing a spreadsheet, in other words. You can put all the cells there and have everything laid out in front of you and know what's going to go in them ultimately.
And if I can interject there, I agree with that strongly, that from a clinical perspective, it really helps to break things down into their components and to take one small piece at a time.
I know very few artists who that mythical thing that happens, which does happen sometimes, where the song or the piece of artwork falls out of the sky. It does happen, but that's a rare occurrence. And if you're going to base your entire artistic career or artistic time on that, you'll be disappointed, most likely, unless you're someone we should know about for sure.
Right. How about another question, Vic?
Well, another question we have is about judging your own work. This person says, I have difficulty judging my own work. How do you approach that?
Ooh, that's a good one. Beth, you want to take a crack at that one?
It is a tricky one. I mean, because you can ask other people's opinions, and you can ask 50 people and get 50 different opinions. So, which doesn't help much. I think you have to just, you've got to really be focused on what it is you want to say, and are you achieving what it is you want to say? And hopefully the authenticity of that is going to present yourself in the best way that you can.
I think this is part of the risk-taking, too, that part of in seeking help and trying to judge my work, I get as knowledgeable as I can, and I continue to learn and grow about work that's work. Painters have a long history of going to museums and sketching other people's work in an effort to learn about it and understand it, and then they give me feedback about my process. So part of it, I think, is building community around it too. Does that make sense, Beth?
I lost a lot of what you just said there. Sorry, the audio is cutting out.
I heard some of it, and it does make sense to me. But and to further take that, one step further for me again is, do you really need to critique yourself per se? I mean, and what is that relative to? I mean, if you're a visual artist or a painter, you paint in a particular style, I guess you could find like artists, but is that ultimately helpful? I think knowing whether your work is good internally is a good thing, and that comes from study. It comes from just being aware of what's out there. But there's a lot of people who come up with things that haven't been done before. I mean, that's also pretty rare. But anyway, go ahead. Yeah. I'm just not so sure that
what?
critiquing yourself is the most important thing. In a way, artists should just create what they create, let the world judge it. You can have a difference of opinion, but quite honestly, having your own opinion about your art in terms of a critique of it is probably going to, if anything, distract you from going the extra step, because that's the risky step.
Right.
Right, and there's multiple reasons why you're doing your art too.
Right, exactly.
Which change that whole perspective.
Yeah, and that's where brilliance comes from, hopefully, that risk taking.
We have two other questions.
Go ahead.
The next one is, how can someone who's primarily left brain oriented turn that off to develop the creative processes?
Well, speaking, hopefully you can hear me. Let me know if you can't, and I'm also going to kick this one to Scott. We've talked about this. I've got a big left brain, and I find that my capacity for deconstruction actually helps me artistically. I don't see them as at odds. I let myself deconstruct, but also set that aside, and this is where I then turn to my curiosity.
Lost Patricia again.
Did we lose her again?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Scott, if you could answer that question.
Yeah, well, along the same lines as you, and if you can hear me, Patricia, you know that you and I have a very similar process, I think.
Yep.
And I'm also very, very left-brained, but I'm clearly extremely right-brained as well. I think it's tricky for people who have spent a lot of their life being left-brained, not exposing their creative side, not tapping into it for whatever reasons. Maybe they were discouraged away from it. So again, I think it's something that takes practice. You have to learn how to turn that on, and I think there are ways to do it. There's all kinds of creative ways to do it. There's exercises just like there are for your body in order to be more creative. I think those things are worth looking into. If you're really having problems tapping into it. I feel kind of uni-brained for maybe the first time in my life. I finally feel like I can go between the two sides. I can be creative for a minute, and then also I can think of the practical things and not feel like I'm being schizophrenic or going crazy, which is not easy.
Hopefully folks can hear this. You can be right-brained and left-brained. It's not one or the other. They're not mutually exclusive.
Yep. Although about 95% of the people who come into my recording studio are left-handed. So, including myself.
Do you have one more question, Vic?
I've got two questions that are related, and so I'm going to put them together.
All right.
One person asked, is public validation necessary for the artist to continue to pursue their art, or can curiosity, risk-taking, etc., let the artist continue to create realistically? And then the second person is saying, if you're chronically ill, isn't the process of creating the most important aspect of the creative process?
Well, I'd like to, if I could, hopefully you can hear me, and then I'll turn it over to Beth and Scott, that the process, I believe, is always important. Certainly as a chronically ill person, but in any endeavor. To me, the key is always in the process, not in the content. The content's important, whether I'm painting, developing a new idea, writing a new concept, developing a new clinical concept, but the key is always in the process. That how am I functioning, what are my capacities? The content varies. In other words, the dance stays the same, but the music changes.
Mm-hmm.
Take a crack at the public validation? Have an opportunity at that before we get ready to sign off.
Yep. Could you repeat that one?
Scott, I think she's asking if you had anything to add to those questions and comments.
Yeah, I got confused about what the question was again now.
About the if public validation is necessary.
Oh, yes.
in process.
Well, yeah. Look, here's the problem. It's impossible to avoid. Should it be as important as it is? Probably not. But we do, to some degree, base our own worth on what other people think about our art. Now, you know, there's examples through history where great artists were recognized in their time, and there's a lot of examples where they weren't. Vincent van Gogh couldn't sell a painting during his lifetime. His paintings sell for more than pretty much anybody now. Does that help him in his life, you know, 200 years later? No, it didn't help at all. But you can't monetize creativity. I don't believe. If it happens, it'll happen because it strikes a chord with people. It just may not be during your time of creation. That's all.
And you can't let the fear of that stop you.
No, you can't let fear stop you. Being creative is a good thing. It's part of being alive. That's the main thing. You know, if you can monetize it later on, turn it into a living, whatever, then so be it. That's great for you. But they're not necessarily going to happen hand in hand. And you shouldn't be discouraged. I know a number of wonderful painters who are not household names who, you know, their skill is as good as anybody I know, and yet they're struggling to be recognized. And therein lies a struggle. They are struggling. So it is difficult to avoid the public perception of your art.
I'm going to have to end it there. I am sure we will pick this discussion up. So hopefully folks can hear me, and persistence and fortitude. So based on everything we're saying, what Scott was just saying, a willingness to fail, concurrently developing self-reliance, finding out what our capacities are, developing our tool chest, that importance of community. When you don't feel you can persevere, you can borrow from strength of others. I have a faith in my capacity to find folks to work with me who can give me good feedback, give me good criticism, and also allow me to grow. I have to allow myself extra time or help to do the more difficult things. Here's one of my favorite quotes: fall down 7 times, get up 8. I want to thank everybody for coming today. I want to really thank Beth and Scott and Vicki for doing this, for being part of this evolving effort to create this platform, this forum for support and creative discussion. And our next meeting, we're going to send folks an invitation by email once the registration is open. I think we're looking at October, and we'll post information on albanyhealthmanagement.com. Please go back and listen to Scott's work and listen to Beth, Scott Patito, and Beth Rinicky. You can check them out on Facebook and get to them through that venue. And I think we're just about there. Beth, Scott, any closing?
I'd just like to say thanks for inviting us to do this, and it was fun.
Yes, it was a pleasure.
I hope people got something out of it, and hope to do it again.
Okay. Well, with that, I think, Vicki, I think it might be time for us to actually end. So, any final thoughts? I'm sorry?
I was just saying thank you, everyone, and we will post this on our website, and the audio-video file from the first meeting is also on our website, so we'll send you those URLs if people want to go back and listen to the first one.
Great.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.